Hi, I'm Graham Blackburn, and this is Traditional Woodworking by Hand. Today's episode is a riddle. When is a hollow around? So I've had several inquiries about planes called hollows and rounds. Now let's put these in perspective. We've talked in the past that in general, planes, wooden planes used in traditional woodworking can be classed into one of three groups. The bench planes that we've talked about, smoothers, jointers, jack planes. We've talked about molding planes that cut moldings, special shapes on the edge of the surface of wood. And we've talked about special purpose planes that make joints or do a particular job that's not a molding. Today, we're going to concentrate on one of the class of planes that belongs to molding planes. And specifically, we're going to be talking about hollows and rounds. The unusual thing about hollows and rounds is that unlike all the other molding planes, many of which you can see behind me, most of them all have lines inscribed on the toe, which you can see if you look very closely here, called the spring lines. And the spring lines indicate the angle at which you should hold the plane. And it has to do with something I might explain later, making the cut even. So this line is the vertical angle at which you should hold the plane, and this line would represent the horizontal line. So if I were to use this plane on the end of the wood, I would hold it at an angle like this, so that the spring line was vertical. Now, there's a second group of molding planes that are designed to be held perfectly upright. And a good example of that is the beading plane. Here's a beading plane. And you can see, if you look behind me, I have a whole selection of beading planes. And these need to be held perfectly upright. So they have a straight fence and a horizontal depth gauge. So if I were making a bead on this piece of wood, I would hold the plane perfectly vertical. But today, we're going to be talking about hollows and rounds. Now, here is a pair of hollows and rounds. The first thing that's unusual about these is that, unlike all the other molding planes, these planes are named for the shape that they are rather than the shape they cut. This beading plane that I just showed you is called a beading plane because it makes a bead. This plane here, which makes a little raised panel, is called a raised panel plane. But this is called a hollow plane, even though when we use it, which I'll do in a second, it makes a round shape. And its companion is the opposite. It's called a round plane, even though in use it makes a hollow. Now let's talk a little more specifically about the hollows and rounds. First of all, I'd like you to see how many I have. Starting from here and all the way along is a whole selection of round planes, different diameters. And then next to them, I have a whole selection of hollow planes that make different kinds of hollows. So let's see how they work. Unlike the molding planes that have a spring line and are required to be held exactly at that angle, and unlike the beading planes that are required to be held vertical, a hollow or a round plane can be held at any angle. Watch this. This is a round plane and it's going to make a hollow. So I start here at the end of the wood. Remember to put your one hand here on the round part And to start with, you take a fairly shallow cut, and it's not going to be particularly straight, but the trick is that the more times you do that, the plane follows the groove that it cut, and it doesn't take very long before the groove or the hollow that this plane makes starts to become perfectly regular. Right? You can see not perfect yet, but we're getting there. Let's look at its partner, the hollow plane. The hollow plane, as I explained, makes a round. So let's go over here and show what happens here. We start the same thing. We push the plane, and you can see I'm holding it upright, and it's taking a bit off the side and a bit off the side here. And if I continue, pretty soon the edge of this piece of wood will be as round as the sole of the plane. Now, that explains the unusual terminology. But there's another thing about hollows and rounds, which is different from molding planes, whether they have spring lines or molding planes that are designed to be held upright, which is that a hollow or a round plane can be held at different angles. You might think that if I were to use this particular round plane, and if I continued long enough, I would end up with a shape that perfectly matched the sole of the plane. You can see already how this fits into the hollow. But what is unusual and extremely useful is that the hollow and or the round plane can be tilted in use. If I wanted to make a groove that was wider than the sole of this plane, all I have to do is to tilt the plane one way or the other. I'm tilting it this way, and I'm expanding the groove that way. I can tilt the plane this way, and it will enlarge the groove that way. So that's one of the advantages of the hollows and rounds. Now let's talk a little bit about the sharpening, because I've had some queries about that. How do you sharpen a round blade? Well, here is a round plane. You can see it's a round plane because it has a round bottom, and I've removed the iron and the wedge. And don't forget that the way to remove these irons and wedges, especially if you haven't used the plane for a long time or you just found one, you don't want to wrestle with this. You might damage things. The way to remove it is to put the wedge in your vise over here. Just the wedge, not the iron, not the rest of the plane. Tighten it up, and then with a mallet or even, a light Warrington hammer, you can tap the plane off the wedge. That way you don't damage anything, and now the wedge comes out. So that's the first thing to know about these planes. Now the second thing is that, pretty obviously, the roundness of the blade has to match the roundness of the sole. And that you can do with a file, you can do on a grindstone, you can do whatever, but assuming that you've got this matching the profile here, the sharpening process is most easily done using a sharpening stone like this. These are curved, and it's a standard curve, and of course the curve may not fit this, but by twisting the blade you can find the right angle at which it will go. I like to sharpen a lot of things together, and I typically use water stones, and after you've used them for a little bit you get a slurry on the top of the stone, and the slurry is really useful for putting on the stone. We can pretend that this is a little bit of a slurry, and then I would turn this until the hollow here matches the hollow there, and I simply sharpen like this. Assuming that as I do this, I'm not adjusting the curve, the other secret that's not immediately apparent is that the actual cutting edge is simply the intersection of the back of the iron with the front of the iron. And it doesn't really matter which side you sharpen. As long as this actually matches the profile, you don't need to mess with that anymore. You can simply sharpen the stone on a regular flat stone. I'll show you one of my nice Japanese stones here. We'll put a little water on this, and all that needs to happen to sharpen this, once this curve is right, is to sharpen the back. Because if I get the back perfectly flat, where the back intersects with the front will give me a perfectly sharp edge. This one hasn't been sharpened in quite a while. It's a plane that I picked up recently. It's not like totally up to par yet, but you can see already how using this stone here, I'm getting the back to be flat. That's the secret of sharpening these planes. So if you can remember how to sharpen the irons, and if you can remember the fact that hollow and round planes are named for the shape they are, not the shape they cut, and if you can remember that unlike all the other molding planes, you can use this plane both perfectly upright or you can use it at an angle, which allows you, even if you don't have as many different planes as I have, and you have one the circumference that doesn't quite match, you have an almost limitless range of shapes that you can make. So I hope that helps, and I hope it encourages you to keep an eye out for hollows and rounds. Because if you go to antique stores or flea markets or even on eBay, the fact that these planes are so simple leads a lot of people to think that, oh, they can't be very complicated, and they tend to be a whole lot less expensive than something like this that looks very complicated. I meant this one here. One last thing is that the range of these typically depends on the circumference, and most hollows and rounds, no matter how wide or how narrow they are, cut an eighth or a sixth of a circle if you were to use them vertically. But there are a couple of other planes that might look like hollows and rounds that actually are complete circles. So this is what's actually known as a spar plane, because one of its most obvious uses is to plane the spar or the mast on a wooden ship. This one will give you a perfect hollow, which might be good for laying pipes or fitting other pieces of wood. So there's a brief introduction to hollows and rounds, how to hold them, how to use them, why they're different from the other kinds of molding planes, and how to sharpen them. I hope you like that. I hope that's useful. If you want to know more, then I've written several books on the subject. Here's volume 1 of a series that I wrote, where you can find out all the different kinds of hollows and round planes there are. And then in this volume here, which is actually volume 2 in the series, you can find a whole chapter on how to use and how to sharpen hollows and rounds. If you want to know more, if that's useful, don't forget to click the subscribe button, and remember that I'm more than happy to answer all your queries and get you going on traditional woodworking by hand. No electricity and no plastic. Thanks for watching.